Henri Matisse was a French visual artist, known for both his use of color and his fluid and original drawings. He was a printmaker, draftsman and sculptor, but is known primarily as a painter. Matisse was born in December 1869, in a tiny tumble-down weaver's cottage in the textile town of Le Cateau, where his father, Émile, was a grain merchant, and his mother Anna ran her husband's shop. She was an accomplished painter of porcelain. Matisse attended secondary school until 1887 in nearby Saint-Quentin. After a year of legal studies in Paris, he returned to Saint-Quentin and became a clerk in a law office. In 1889, while recovering from a severe attack of appendicitis, he began to paint with the aid of textbooks. He discovered a kind of paradise, as he later described it, and at the age of 21, decided to become a professional artist, deeply disappointing his father, who wanted him to be a lawyer. In 1891, he enrolled in the privately run Académie Julian in Paris, to potentially qualify as an art teacher. His instructor told him he could not draw, and would never learn. This harsh criticism deeply affected Matisse, who had always grappled with self-doubt and a sense of inadequacy. He left the school in 1892 to take night classes at the more practical Paris School of Decorative Arts. Matisse applied for a place at the prestigious Paris School of Fine Arts in 1892, when he was around 22 years old, but failed the entry exam. Despite this setback, he managed to enter the school by the back door, by gaining sponsorship from the famous artist Gustave Moreau, who accepted students to his classes at the school regardless of their exam results. Matisse then spent 6 years studying at the school under Moreau. Moreau encouraged his students to paint, to think in terms of tone and color, and to develop their own artistic personalities. He urged them to learn from the treasures in the Louvre, an experience that led to Matisse experimenting with form and color. In 1895, Matisse finally passed the entrance exam for the Paris School of Fine Arts, at his third attempt. The next year, several of his paintings were exhibited at the Paris Salon. In 1896, when Matisse was 27, Moreau urged him to exhibit 4 paintings at the Salon of the National Society of Fine Arts, where the artist scored a major triumph. His painting Woman Reading was purchased by the government, and Matisse was elected an associate member of the Salon Society. From this point on, he seemed certain of a respected academic painting career, which gave him more confidence, both as an artist and in himself. The following year, he took his first major step toward what he later called his stylistic liberation, creating a minor scandal at the Salon with his painting The Dinner Table. Here he combined a luminosity reminiscent of Renoir, with a firmly classical composition, in deep red and green. The Dinner Table looks, to modern eyes, like an unexceptional impressionist painting. Nonetheless, the work was considered objectionable to Matisse's academic supporters at the time. He wrote later that the pure colors of Impressionism contain within them the power to affect the feelings of the viewer, which was his aim in painting this work. In 1898, Matisse married a young woman he met at a wedding, Amélie Pariah. In worldly terms, Henri Matisse had nothing to recommend him. At the time of his marriage, he was an unknown painter who had no money of his own. She, however, saw in him what she most wanted in a lifetime's companion, someone who would always go his own way, regardless of what others might think of him. From then on, the pair raised 4-year-old Marguerite, his daughter from an earlier relationship with his lover at the time and his model, Caroline Joblau. After their wedding, Matisse and his new wife spent part of their honeymoon in London, where Matisse was able to view artist J.M. Turner's works at the Tate Gallery. They then traveled to Corsica, where Amélie had relatives. Matisse, who had grown up in cool and cloudy northern France, was totally dazzled by the light in Corsica. "Everything glistens," he said. "Everything is color, everything is light." They stayed in Corsica for 5 months, where Matisse seemed to develop a new and stronger understanding of color as the key medium for his imaginative expression. This period was a revelation to him, and the 50 or so paintings he produced there paved the way for his Fauvist period, which was to follow a few years later. Back in France, the reaction of his colleagues to his Corsican canvases was less than ecstatic. They were deemed too primitive and disturbing to be shown. One painter friend said of a batch which arrived in Paris that they looked like they had been painted by a mad and epileptic impressionist. By July, Amélie was pregnant with their first child, and they moved to Toulouse in southwest France to be with her family. This was another new location which inspired a series of paintings, and a further phase of Matisse's artistic development. Henri and Amélie eventually had two sons, John, born in 1899, who becomes a sculptor, and Pierre, born in 1900, who would eventually run an important New York art gallery. For several years, Matisse and his wife were too poor to keep their children together. The infant Pierre was cared for by his grandmother in Berhaine, or by a wet nurse in a neighboring town. Meanwhile, Matisse and his wife lived and worked in his rented fifth-floor Paris studio with views onto Notre Dame. It was a time of anxiety and humiliation. His work was dismissed by the art establishment and mocked by the public. By 1899, Matisse, who was in continuing financial difficulties, was obliged to accept work on the decoration of the Grand Palais in Paris, which was being erected to house part of the new Universal Exposition in the Champs-Élysées. Before her marriage, Amélie had shown a gift for designing and making hats for a fashionable clientele. In June 1899 she opened a hat shop of her own, and the couple, along with daughter Marguerite, moved into a small apartment just down the street from her shop. Amélie hoped to help make ends meet, and to ensure her new husband was able to continue painting full-time, which she was determined to encourage. The hardship of his personal life with no patron or dealer to support him made life difficult. Matisse tended to be obsessive and anxious, and he had good reason for it. He was married, with 3 children. He had a low-paying job painting exhibition decorations by the meter at the Grand Palais for a living, and he regarded his apprenticeship as a painter as far from finished. Despite this, he worked from morning to night to produce a feeling of spontaneity in his art, which was in fact thoroughly rehearsed. Matisse first became aware of Neo-Impressionist artist Paul Signoc's work in 1898, after reading his essay, From Lydia Delectorskaya to Neo-Impressionism. The article introduced Matisse to the idea of producing visual color mixing through juxtaposed dots of color, which he could use in his paintings. The method appealed to Matisse, and he adopted it as a means of modeling light through color. Pointillism, as the technique is known, is a systematic method of simulating color and light on the canvas by using short brush strokes and pure color. An example is Matisse's still life, First Orange, which represented a significant departure from his earlier academic approach. By keeping colors unmixed and placing them in close proximity, they are perceived to optically blend in the viewer's eye, creating a more luminous and vibrant effect than could be achieved by physically mixing pigments. This contrasted with the Impressionists' approach of mixing colors on the palette before applying them to the canvas. This bright study in orange and green is one of the artist's first major paintings of the female figure. The technique is suggestive of Neo-Impressionism, but is here handled with surprising impetuosity. In the next few years, Matisse continued the theme, creating pictures that were increasingly impetuous and free. Sideboard and Table reflects the pointillist approach, but with none of their methodical application. The color is pursued for its own sake, the application of the paint having a fascination of its own. Other pictures are less precise. Some of them are freely dappled with color. The way in which Matisse set green against orange or scarlet against violet was strangely impulsive, almost reckless. In the early years of the 20th century, Matisse became absorbed in the study of the human figure through painting and sculpture. His daughter Marguerite and wife Amélie often served as the models in his experiments. Paul Cézanne and Auguste Rodin were artists Matisse looked to for guidance and direction. During 1899, he began to attend an evening class in sculpture. His early work in 3 dimensions, the first of some 60 pieces he executed during his lifetime, reveal the influence of Rodin. More than half of his total output of sculpture dates to between 1900 and 1909. These works reveal a deep interest in the human figure, as well as ancient and early modern works of art. He devoted much of his energy to working in clay, completing the Surf in 1903. He also frequently worked in series, manipulating the forms and simplifying them over the years. Color in his paintings was of less importance during this period, and many of his works appear dark and gloomy. Matisse's self-portrait painted in 1900 is an indication of this somber quality. In 1901, he showed for the first time at the Salon of the Independents, which had been founded in 1884 as a refuge for painters unacceptable to the official exhibition juries. Many of his early works share the moody palette and grand compositions of the old masters, and Matisse continued, with some long interruptions, to study traditional methods with his teacher Moreau until the artist's death. Although Matisse was now nearing 30, he was still driven by feelings of inadequacy, and a desire to master traditional techniques, which he thought he lacked. To address what he saw as his shortcomings, he decided to continue his training, and he began painting with portraitist Eugène Carrière at the Académie Carrière. Eventually, his prolonged studies allowed him to fully embrace his own innovative style. In 1902, a political and financial scandal rocked the French nation when it was discovered that Madame Thérèse Humbert, daughter-in-law to the deceased Minister of Justice, had swindled nearly 100 million francs from the French government and its citizens over a 20-year period. Matisse's in-laws became ensnared in the scandal when the Humberts vanished, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin. Armand Pereire, Matisse's father-in-law, had been the confidential assistant to Frédéric and Thérèse Humbert, and Catherine Pereire, his wife, had been their social secretary. Matisse's in-laws lost everything. When the Humberts were found in Madrid and brought back to Paris, the case took on a new dimension. As their presumed accomplice, Armand Pereire was charged with complicity in fraud and forgery, and imprisoned in a Paris jail. Their public exposure, followed by the arrest of his father-in-law, left Matisse as the sole breadwinner for an extended family of 7. While Armand Pereire was initially charged, there was no evidence presented to prove his actual complicity in the fraud. The charges against him were finally dropped after Matisse intervened on his behalf. Under the extreme stress, Matisse's wife's health failed, and her hat shop went out of business. The family left Paris with their 3 children, and did not return until 1903. Matisse took his family back to his parents' home in Bohane, where he presented them with the spectacle of his wife, bearing one of the most vilified names in France. He rented an attic to use as a studio, which he captured in his painting, Studio Under the Eaves. Shadows dominate the room. The view through the window suggests the possibility of a brighter future. Being the sole breadwinner for his extended family, Matisse abandoned his experimental canvases and began turning out small, drab and inexpensive pictures that he hoped he could sell easily, since no one in the family was producing any income. The Humbert affair turned Matisse inward, and he later admitted that the iron discipline, neatness, and punctuality of his mature years were a direct result of this traumatic experience. It was a dark period for Matisse, both financially and artistically, as he struggled to support his family amidst the humiliation and the scandal. For the time being, Matisse's paintings were far from ferocious. Paintings like Carmelina were relatively somber, rigorously studied from life, and modeled in deep tone. Their force was wholly traditional. Technically, Matisse was consolidating his ground, but he was also pondering the implications of his earlier works. His caution was a part of his strength. He never moved until the way ahead was clear. All his life his development proceeded by alternate forward steps and pauses. When the time came for each step, he was entirely convinced of its rightness and beauty, and ready to hold forth on the subject. Matisse had his first solo exhibition at the Amboise Vollard Gallery in Paris in 1904, but it was not successful. After buying a villa in Saint-Tropez, a small fishing village in Provence, artist Paul Signac transformed part of it into his studio. Soon after settling in together with his wife and mother, Signac invited other painters to join him. Among these was Henri Matisse, who arrived in 1904. That summer, Matisse painted with Signac and his friend, Henri Edmond Cross, both of whom considered themselves Neo-Impressionists. As a result of the experience, Matisse's fondness for bright and expressive color became more pronounced. In that year, he painted the most important of his works in the Neo-Impressionist style, a piece called Luxury, Peace, and Pleasure. The painting's title comes from a poem by French poet Charles Baudelaire. It reads, "There, all is order and beauty, luxury, peace, and pleasure." The need for harmonious quietness preoccupied Matisse continually. This idea of balance and serenity would remain a consistent theme in his work throughout the next 50 years. The painting was exhibited at the Salon of the Independents in Paris in 1905 to great acclaim, and was promptly purchased by artist Paul Signac, who was delighted with it. But the Indian summer of Neo-Impressionism was over for Matisse. In his works that followed, the orderliness was by no means so apparent, and his Neo-Impressionist style was progressively transformed. In 1905, while on vacation, Matisse and artist friend André Derain painted together in a small French fishing port on the Mediterranean coast. Reveling in the bright sunlight of the south of France, the pair began to introduce unnaturalistic colors and vivid brushstrokes into their paintings. These optically dynamic works, of bright clashing colors, used paint straight from the tube, which was laid down in rapid bold strokes. Swirls and slabs of spontaneous brushwork exploded into an emotional display of complementary colors, red against green, orange against blue, and yellow against violet. Matisse and Derain had learned that color could serve not just an element of composition, it could provide the basis for it. They found it no longer necessary to outline an object, fill it in with color, and model the object by use of tonality. The object itself could be built by color, and the color could be pure and bright. Later that year, Matisse's painting Open Window was exhibited at the Autumn Salon, alongside works by a number of artists who also had been experimenting with violent color. One Paris art critic described the exhibition as an orgy of pure color and referred to the group as Fauves, the French word for wild beasts. However, he went on to compliment Matisse, whom he described as robustly gifted. Other critics were less positive. One described the works as a pot of colors flung in the face of the public. Another saw the works as the barbarous and naive games of a child playing with a box of colors. The artists were even accused of using their colors like sticks of dynamite. Matisse's painting Woman with a Hat was at the center of the controversy, and marked a stylistic shift from the dabs of paint of his earlier work to a more expressive style. Fast brushwork and brilliant colors dominate the work, expressing the joy he felt in painting his wife. However, the loose and unfinished quality of the work shocked viewers as much as its vivid non-naturalistic colors. Almost immediately Matisse, along with André Derain, were seen as the group's leaders. Matisse became the most talked about artist in Paris, widely scorned as an anarchist who wanted to tear down everything good that Frenchmen held sacred in art. Woman with a Hat was sold at the exhibition to American art collector enthusiast Leo Stein, brother of the writer Gertrude Stein, for 500 francs. The Steins thought the new pictorial language might just be the next big thing, and worth the investment. Both Leo and Gertrude Stein, as well as their American friends, Etta and Claribel Cohn, became the first to collect Matisse's work, which improved the embattled artist's morale considerably. The Fauves were the first to break with Impressionism, as well as with older traditional methods of perception, such as three-dimensional space. Instead, they used flat areas, or patches of color, to create a new pictorial space on the canvas. Their bold use of clashing colors expressed feeling as well as form, and they worked directly from the world around them. Their preferred subjects were portraits, interiors and landscapes, where they emphasized the visual impact of color in the painting, rather than producing a narrative or hidden symbolism. This painting, which Matisse executed in rich, autumnal colors, is the distillation of Fauvism, where a preference for carefree figures and light-hearted subject matter reflected their desire to create an art that would appeal to the viewer's senses. First exhibited at the Salon of the Independents in 1906, the subject and the distorted perspective caused even greater outrage than Woman with a Hat. Critics were horrified by the flatness, bright colors, eclectic style and mixed technique of the painting. The Joy of Life, which went against every possible norm of pictorial order and painterly finesse, excited near riots of derision from the public. A year later, Matisse again shocked the public when he showed his painting, Blue Nude, Memory of Biskra, at the Society of Independent Artists exhibition in 1907. Here, Matisse combined the traditional subject of the female nude with the influence of primitive sources. The woman's face appears mask-like in the use of strong outlines and harsh contrasts of light and dark, and the hard lines of her body recall the angled planar surfaces common to African sculpture. The painting was purchased by Gertrude and Leo Stein, who later sold it to the Cohn sisters, who were friends of the Steins. They eventually bequeathed it to the Baltimore Museum of Art. Pablo Picasso, upon seeing the blue nude, sneered, "If he wants to make a woman, let him make a woman. If he wants to make a design, let him make a design." In 1913, Matisse was represented by 13 pictures in the much-discussed New York Armory show. When the exhibition arrived in Chicago, he was given some useful publicity when students at the Art Institute of Chicago held a mock trial of the painting. Matisse was charged with artistic murder, pictorial arson, total degeneracy of color and criminal misuse of line. They then burned an effigy of the painting. Fauvism, however, was a short-lived art movement. By 1908 many of the Fauves saw it as a transitional learning stage, and had taken up Cubism. Matisse, for his part, regained an interest in line work as a counterpoint to his simplified forms, setting him on a career-long path that he described as construction by colored surfaces. Even after the dissolution of the group, Fauvism's ideas surrounding color and subjectivity continued to influence other artists for decades. Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso first met at Gertrude Stein's Paris Salon in 1906. While the artists initially disliked each other's paintings, they sensed the power that each held to challenge and motivate the other's work. Both men had a self-confident, combative intelligence, and a mutual respect and admiration for each other. They were strong contemporaries whose fame often rose and fell in line with one another. The two artists became part of Leo and Gertrude Stein's social circle, and routinely joined the gatherings that took place on Saturday evenings at the Steins' Paris apartment. Yet, the competitive nature of their relationship never diminished. Many of their works were painted in response to something they'd seen painted by the other. Matisse famously called their relationship a boxing match. They were each other's biggest fans, as well as their harshest critics. Picasso, who was 11 years younger than Matisse, once said, "No one has ever looked at Matisse's painting more carefully than I, and no one has looked at mine more carefully than he." When Picasso saw Matisse's painting, The Joy of Life, He immediately recognized the originality and innovation of the work and took it as a challenge to create something even more phenomenal. He set to work on The Young Ladies of Avignon, a striking, large-scale abstract painting of 5 female figures in a brothel. While The Young Ladies of Avignon was initially received with horror, even by Picasso's friends, it later proved to be one of his greatest masterpieces. Matisse thought it a joke, but later responded with his painting Bathers with a Turtle, for him something shadowy and strange, in which 3 stone-faced, awkwardly posed nude women observe a turtle. One woman offers it a scrap of food. Eventually, Picasso immersed himself in Cubism. Not to be outdone, Matisse responded with an abstract portrait of Madame Matisse. The portrait expresses no specific feeling, but registers innumerable emotions. Picasso then countered with his portrait of a young girl, painted in 1914. The pair maintained their friendly rivalry until Matisse died in 1954. All things considered, Picasso once said, "There is only one Henri Matisse." To which Matisse responded, "Only one person has the right to criticize me. And it's Pablo Picasso." By 1907, Matisse's work was encountering strong criticism. He was repeatedly under attack for his unorthodox use of color and his lack of interest in representing naturalistic anatomy. This made it difficult for him to earn enough money to provide for his family. Hans Perman, a German painter and a great friend of both Matisse and the Steins, persuaded him to create a teaching academy as a way to provide him with a regular income and a large studio. A fitting space was found in 2 large halls of an old convent. His friends organized and financed Academy Matisse, with the Steins paying for the rental, heating and model costs. The academy quickly expanded into a mecca for international students, mainly from Germany, the United States, and Scandinavia. It became one of the most successful academies at the time, and operated from 1907 until 1911. Matisse, however, was a particularly reluctant teacher, wanting to focus more on his own work. Perman agreed to running the day-to-day affairs of the academy as head student, overseeing classes every weekday morning, and liaising between students and Matisse. Matisse would then critique work every Saturday morning. It was Matisse's critiques that were the most daunting for his students, and he is recorded as being stern and limited with his praise. In 1908, Matisse published his book, Notes of a Painter, where he explained the seeming contradiction between freedom and tradition in his art. To copy the objects in a still life is nothing, he said, one must render the emotion they awaken in you. It was this ability to explain his artistic ideas clearly that so influenced his students, opening the eyes of many. Although the Academy Matisse only lasted 3 years, over 100 foreign artists were trained there. Amélie, Matisse's wife, was so engaged in Matisse's career that she had acted as both his companion and his personal manager through the early years of their marriage. Their relationship began to suffer when Matisse actively began to seek more independence. This started after he began accepting commissions from Sergei Shukin, a Russian art collector who lived in Moscow. Shukin bought his first painting from Matisse in 1897, while in Paris. This started Shukin off on a wild art buying spree which eventually resulted in his collection containing over 250 Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings, including 50 Picassos, 28 Matisses, 13 Monets, 8 Cezannes, 4 Van Goghs, and 16 Gauguins. Between 1906 and 1914, Shukin bought 37 paintings from Matisse. In 1909, Matisse had to move from his Sacré-Cœur convent studio, which he had occupied since 1907, as the government had decided to sell it off. By now accustomed to the spacious accommodations the convent provided, as well as to its park-like setting, he needed to look beyond Paris to find an affordable equivalent. His increasing income from his sales to Shukin and other collectors, such as Leo and Gertrude Stein and the Cohn sisters, allowed him to move into a bigger house with a garden, in the town of Issy-les-Moulineaux, 10 kilometers from Paris, where he built a large studio next to the house. Here, he was able to spend more time alone than in the cramped studio homes the family had shared in the past. Matisse's lack of dependence on Amélie was difficult for her, and they spent less time together. By 1908, many artists began to take a renewed interest in post-impressionist artist Paul Cézanne, and the analytical approach he took to his paintings. Abandoning the frivolity of Fauvism, they embraced order and structure instead. Matisse, however, continued to use the distinctive Fauvist hallmarks of bright emotive colors, simple shapes and painterly mark-making in his work. However, he was too much of a rationalist to abandon order in his work altogether, and his need for balanced colors and simple line was still evident in the major works he produced up until the end of World War I. In these works, the forms tend to be outlined in flowing heavy contours, and to have few interior details. The color is laid on in large, thin and luminous, carefully calculated patches, and shadows are practically eliminated. The picture space is either extremely shallow, or warped into a flatness that parallels the plane of the canvas, defying academic rules for perspective and foreshortening. The total effect resembles the patterns of rugs, textiles, and ceramics that Matisse collected over his lifetime. He had his first New York City exhibition at Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Gallery in 1908 and also exhibited in Moscow and Berlin. The first Matisse painting acquired by a public collection was Still Life with Geraniums, painted in 1910, which is exhibited today in the Gallery of Modern Art in Munich, Germany. This painting, The Pink Studio, depicts his studio at his new home. It was painted as part of a sequence of works requested by Sergei Shchukin, Matisse's patron. Shchukin eagerly purchased the Pink Studio, but declined to acquire a companion piece, the Red Studio. The Red Studio, painted in 1911, is a view of Matisse's studio filled with what amounts to a retrospective of his work. Small versions of his paintings are propped against the walls, which are rendered in unmodulated rust red. There are no windows or doors, or much in the way of perspective. Delicate white lines suggest corners, and intriguingly, there is a grandfather clock with no hands. The painting remained in Matisse's possession for 16 years, during which time it traveled to the second post-impressionist exhibition in London in 1912. The exhibition showed 16 Matisse paintings, as well as Matisse's plaster sculpture, The Spider. Matisse's later career can be divided into several periods that changed stylistically, however his underlying aim always remained the same. As he himself put it in his Notes of a Painter in 1908, it was, to discover the essential character of things, and to produce an art of balance, purity, and serenity. In 1909, Matisse created Dance 1 as a study for a painting he was commissioned to make for Sergei Shchukin for the staircase of his Moscow home, which by 1914 already contained 37 of his works. Dance 1 marks a moment in Matisse's career when he embraced a reductive approach to painting, seeking the expressive potential of line, color, and form, as they came together in this painting in an unhampered expression of joy. Matisse knew he'd attained something special in this work, and called it the overpowering climax of luminosity. The final version, and its associated painting music, were both completed in 1910, and are in the collection of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Here, Matisse has used only 4 naturalistic colors, blue for the sky, green for the ground, and 2 shades of red in rendering the 5 figures. He conveys a remarkable fluidity and sense of dynamic movement in the sweeping curve along the front side of the left figure, and along the outstretched arms of the dancers. The mood here is more tense than in Dance 1. The dancers are blood red, and new line work shows straining muscles. The dance is now less a dance of celebration, and more one of ritual. In his second painting for the commission, Music, Matisse worked without any preliminary sketches, and the painting bears many traces of the modifications he needed to find the intended effect. As in dance, his aim was to show man's attainment of a state of completeness by immersion in creativity. After viewing a large exhibition of Islamic art in Munich in 1910, Matisse spent 2 months in Spain studying Moorish art. While painting in Tangier, he made several changes to the way he worked. He began using black and intense unmodulated color, which added a new boldness to his work. Between 1912 and 1913, he spent 7 months in Morocco, producing about 24 paintings and numerous drawings. His frequent Orientalist topics of later paintings, such as the harem, can be traced to this period. Goldfish in aquariums also became a frequently recurring theme in Matisse's art following his trip. One of his paintings from this period, Basket with Oranges, was bought by Picasso. Matisse also exhibited at the time in both Cologne and London. At the beginning of World War I, Matisse at 45 was too old for military service. When the German army was 50 kilometers from Paris, he fled with his family to the southern city of Collioure. They returned later, when the fighting had died down, and settled in Paris. 1913 to 1917 were 4 years of experimentation for Matisse, painting in his studio near Notre Dame. He was now among the most famous artists in Paris, and in one of the most radical and fertile periods of his career. It was at this time that he produced Goldfish and Palette, and a sparse diagrammatic view of Notre Dame. Both paintings are now in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He often worked with one model for extended periods, beginning in 1916 with an Italian model called Loretta, who posed for nearly 50 paintings in the year they met, including the studio, which is now in the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. Loretta reawakened his passion for the female form. Their working relationship, played out on canvas, continued until December 1917, when Matisse moved to the south of France to escape the cold of a Paris winter. Influenced by Cubism, many of Matisse's compositions at this time were more austere, almost geometrically structured, and at times close to abstraction. His painting, The Piano Lesson, is a picture of his son Pierre, practicing piano as a young boy. A darkening garden seen through the window is reduced to a green wedge, an echoing triangle of shadow cast by a harsh interior light, obscures part of the boy's face. Matisse painted this while Pierre was serving in World War I, and was perhaps conjuring up earlier and happier memories. Matisse considered Bathers by a River to be one of the 5 most pivotal works of his career. Originally, the work was part of his 1909 commission for the Russian collector Sergei Shukhin, for his Moscow home. At the time, Matisse proposed 3 pastoral images, though Shukhin decided to purchase only 2 works, Dance and Music. 4 years later, Matisse returned to this rejected 3rd canvas, altering the idyllic scene and changing the pastel palette to reflect his interest in Cubism. He made the figures more columnar, with faceless, ovoid heads. He transformed the background into 4 vertical bands, and turned the formerly blue river into a thick black vertical band. With its restricted palette and severely abstracted forms, Bathers by a River is stylistically far removed from the Dance and Music, which both convey a graceful lyricism. The importance of Bathers by a River lies not only in the formal qualities of the paintings, but also in the physical nature of the picture, which bears the history of its manufacture. This amazing painting seems to have emerged out of Matisse's complicated search for direction, a search that took many turns, before the artist eventually found his way. Between 1913 and 1917, Matisse produced some of the most demanding, experimental, and enigmatic works of his career. These paintings are abstracted, and rigorously purged of descriptive detail. They are geometric, and sharply composed. Works from this period have typically been treated as unrelated to one another, and are either an aberration within the artist's development, or a response to Cubism. But middle age, growing affluence, an established international reputation, and the disruptions of World War I gradually combined to isolate Matisse from the centers of avant-gardism. Matisse arrived in Nice in December 1917. Determined to spend the winter there, he rented a long and narrow room at the Hôtel Beau Rivage on the Promenade des Anglais, which he occupied for 3 months. The uninspiring decor of the room was improved by the presence of a large window overlooking the sea. As in his earliest days in Paris, he made this small space his home studio, while his wife Amélie remained at their home near Paris. In October 1918, he rented a room at the Mediterranean Hotel, where he spent his winters until 1921, returning during the summers to Issy-les-Moulineaux in Paris. The years 1917 to 1930 are known as Matisse's early Nice period, when his principal subject remained the female figure or an odalisque dressed in oriental costume or in various stages of undress. All in a luxurious, exotic interior of Matisse's own creation. The reduced size of his pictures at this time reflects the change in his environmental circumstances. He was working in small, improvised studios set up in hotel rooms, rather than in the large permanent establishment at Issy or in his old Paris studio overlooking Notre Dame. He began using cohesive space and blended brushwork, depicting figures in exotic costumes in the textile-sheathed interior of his Nice studio. Many of them emanate a hothouse atmosphere, suggestive of a harem. The seductive outlining of the model here indicates a new and more intimate feeling for the natural spontaneous poses of the female form. Matisse seems to be demonstrating that he can do without the arbitrary stiffness of conventional studio poses. Matisse claimed he created these works as an excuse to paint the nude, but he seems to have taken greater pleasure in the women's excessively ornamental environments. His paintings were popular, but some art critics claimed they were shallow and purely decorative. In 1921, Matisse rented an apartment on the 3rd floor in the Pierre-Lachaise Palace, before moving to the 4th floor in 1927. From then on, he spent half the year in Nice. In 1928, his wife Amélie, who was suffering medical problems, joined him in Nice and lived with him for an extended period. This painting, Interior at Nice, is part of a series of images he created using his apartment as a backdrop. The pink tiled floors and yellow, arabesque patterned wallpaper are present in many of these works, as are the skirted dressing table, oval mirror, shuttered French window, and balcony. The balcony was one of the artist's favorite themes, allowing him to link internal and external space into a continuum, structured by patterns and modulated light. In 1922, following a trip to Morocco, Matisse embarked on a series of odalisks, a genre of Orientalist art featuring eroticized depictions of harems or concubines, like reclining odalisque with magnolias, painted a year after his return from North Africa. More recently, in 2018, this painting sold at Christie's New York for $80 million. Over the next 8 years, Matisse devoted himself to the theme of the odalisque, basing the majority of these compositions on a model and former dancer named Henri Delectorskaya, who was working as a film extra when she first met the artist. The sensuality of these works never fixates on a breast or a thigh, but expands to cover every part of the canvas. Lydia Delectorskaya was a penniless Russian émigré who had fled to France with her aunt to escape the Russian Revolution. Being poor, Delectorskaya was driven to trade on her good looks to make a living, working as a dancer, model and film extra on the Riviera. Initially she modeled for Matisse when required, then in 1932, impressed by her ingenuity and hard work, Matisse hired her as a carer to look after his ailing wife Amélie. It was not long before Delectorskaya evolved from simply being Amélie's caregiver to Matisse's general assistant. He put her in charge of household affairs and all things related to his studio. Lydia said later that Matisse impressed her as the first painter she had met who did not try to get her into bed. In 1935, Lydia became Matisse's sole model. For the next 4 years he produced at least 90 paintings of her, as well as numerous drawings and sketches. She became indispensable to him. Both Matisse and Delectorskaya always denied they were ever lovers. Matisse, 40 years Lydia's senior, stated that he was too committed to painting to waste his time on starting a dalliance with his 22-year-old model. His statement is reminiscent of a comment Matisse made to his wife Amélie before they were married. "Madam, I love you dearly. But I shall always love painting more." In 1938, Matisse bought a large apartment in the former Regina Hotel, an historic building in Nice. It was here that Lydia's close working partnership with Matisse drew an ultimatum from his wife of 40 years. "It's her or me," she said. And Matisse chose his wife. When Matisse told Delectorskaya she could no longer work for him, Lydia attempted suicide by shooting herself in the chest. Remarkably, she survived, with no serious after-effects. In 1939, Amélie initiated divorce proceedings, and the property of the spouses, including paintings and drawings, were to be divided in half. But the artist believed he could not survive such stress, and the divorce never took place. The couple lived apart for the remainder of their lives, but remained legally married until Henri's death in 1954. After the marriage finally failed and Amélie moved out, Lydia returned to help in the studio. It was at Matisse's request. Henri Matisse and Lydia Delectorskaya were visiting Paris in June 1940 when the German army arrived at the start of the Second World War. They managed to return to Nice shortly after the invasion, and remained in Vichy France throughout the war. Although he was never a member of the resistance, it became a point of pride to the occupied French that one of their most acclaimed artists chose to stay. While the Nazis occupied France from 1940 to 1944, they were more lenient in their attacks on degenerate art in Paris than they were in the German-speaking nations under their military dictatorship. Matisse was allowed to exhibit, along with other former Fauvists and Cubists, whom Hitler had initially claimed to despise. Artists exhibiting in France had to sign an oath assuring their Aryan status, including Matisse. All Jewish artists' works were purged from French museums and galleries. Matisse's paintings were on view with other Fauve painters at the Autumn Salon of 1943, and in the group shows at Galerie Charpentier. The Vichy government bought 2 drawings from his show of recent drawings at Galerie Louis Carré in 1941. Matisse required major surgery for a duodenal cancer in 1941. While his treatment was successful, it resulted in serious complications from which he nearly died. He spent the following years recuperating, working as best he could, and worrying about his wife and children, who were active in the French resistance. Matisse was bedridden for 3 months. He found painting and sculpture to be a physical challenge, so he turned instead to creating cutouts, using paper and scissors. With the help of Lydia, he cut sheets of paper pre-painted with gouache into shapes of varying colors and sizes, and arranged them to form lively compositions. Initially, these pieces were modest in size, but eventually transformed into murals, or room-sized works. The result was a distinct and dimensional complexity, an art form that was not quite painting, and not quite sculpture. He called his last 14 years, his second life. In 1943, Matisse had to leave Nice due to the Allied bombings. He decided to move 25 kilometers away, to Vence, and settled at the Villa Le Rêve. He created his final painted series during the 5.5 years he spent there. In 1945, he produced his first major cutout project, a limited edition artist's book titled Jazz. It contained prints of colorful paper-cut collages, accompanied by his thoughts in writing. These cutouts were conceived as designs for stencil prints, to be looked at in a book, rather than as pictorial works. Matisse remained mostly isolated in southern France throughout the Second World War, but his family was intimately involved with the French resistance. His son Pierre, an art dealer in New York, helped the Jewish and anti-Nazi French artists he represented to escape occupied France and enter the United States. Matisse's estranged wife Amélie, who had worked as a typist for the French underground, was jailed for 6 months. His daughter Marguerite, who had been active in the resistance during the war, was tortured by the Gestapo and sentenced to the Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. Marguerite managed to escape from the train to Ravensbrück, which was halted during an Allied air raid. She survived in the woods in the chaos of the closing days of the war, until rescued by fellow members of the resistance. Matisse's first paper cutouts, made as early as 1919, were a way of working out ideas for his larger painted works of art. The number of independently conceived cutouts steadily increased, following his book. These eventually led to the creation of mural-size works, such as Oceania the Sky and Oceania the Sea, of 1946. Under Matisse's direction, Lydia, his studio assistant, loosely pinned the silhouettes of birds, fish, and marine vegetation directly onto the walls of the room. The 2 Oceania pieces, his first cutouts of this scale, show the influence of the trip he made to Tahiti years before. His Blue Nude series feature prime examples of the technique he called painting with scissors. They demonstrate Matisse's ability to use his eye for color and geometry in a new medium of utter simplicity, but with playful and delightful power. Modest experiments grew into ambitious undertakings, allowing him to expand his technique in a truly decorative context. His compositions of paper cutouts led to a total design for a convent chapel in Vence, often referred to as the Matisse Chapel. Matisse created all the wall decorations, stations of the cross, furniture, stained glass windows, even the vestments and altar cloths. The project horrified not only much of the Catholic hierarchy, but also a contemporary art world that had come to reject religious sentiment. But Matisse's prestige, and the fact that he largely financed the project himself, ensured that the chapel opened in 1951 in a ceremony led by the Archbishop of Nice. In 1950, Matisse represented France at the 25th edition of the Venice Biennale, and won the grand prize for painting for his lifelong contributions to art. In 1951, a major retrospective exhibition of his works was held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It then traveled to Cleveland, Chicago, and San Francisco. Matisse's first all-cutouts exhibition took place in Paris in 1953. Henri Matisse died of a heart attack at the age of 84 in November 1954. He is buried in the cemetery of the monastery of Our Lady of Cimiez, in the neighborhood of Nice. His wife, Amélie, died 4 years later, and is buried with him. After Matisse's death, Lydia Delectorskaya knew she wasn't going to be invited to the funeral by Matisse's family, so she packed her bags and left them to carry out the funeral arrangements themselves. She lived alone in Paris for the rest of her life, devoted to working with the artist's heritage. She helped organize Matisse exhibitions, and in 1952, the opening of a museum in his hometown of Le Cateau-Cambrésis. This museum is now the 3rd largest collection of Matisse works in France. The 90 or so artworks Matisse bequeathed to her, she donated to the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. It is largely thanks to her that the holdings of the works of Matisse in Russia today are the best in the world. Lydia died in 1998, aged 87, taking her own life. Her cemetery memorial stone bears words attributed to Picasso. Matisse preserved her beauty for all eternity. The remarkable career of Henri Matisse spanned almost 6.5 decades. He was one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, and fundamentally altered the course of modern art. His artistic legacy has continued to inspire and challenge young painters long after his death, contributing significantly to the development of abstract expressionism, color field painting, and other modernist movements. His emphasis on the expressive power of color and form, as well as his constant innovation and experimentation, provides a model for artists seeking to push the boundaries of painting in new directions, even today.